3 chilling true stories from the Bridgewater Triangle. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for number 3. Story number 1. The Hairy Man of Hockomock Swamp. The winter of 1970 had an unnatural stillness in the town of Bridgewater. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the icy grip of January seemed to seep into everything. Yet, to the group of kids who lived on the edge of the infamous Hockomock Swamp, the cold was an invitation for adventure. The swamp, with its dense, skeletal trees and frozen marshland, was the perfect setting for a day of exploration. They were a pack of 7, boys and girls, aged between 10 and 14, wrapped in layers of mismatched winter gear. They laughed and shouted as they trudged deeper into the swamp, their boots crunching over snow and ice. The farther they went, the darker the swamp seemed to grow. The sunlight filtered weakly through the gnarled branches above, casting long, spidery shadows on the ground. The air was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. About an hour in, the group reached a clearing where the trees pulled back, exposing a patch of frozen marshland. It was here that they decided to stop and catch their breath. One of the older boys, Danny, suggested they test the ice to see how far they could walk across it. The others hesitated. Everyone had heard the stories about kids falling through the ice, but the lure of adventure was too strong. They edged carefully onto the ice, their steps tentative at first. The ice groaned beneath their weight, but it held. Emboldened, they ventured farther out, giggling nervously as they slid across the slick surface. They were nearly in the center of the clearing when it happened. A scream pierced the air, sharp and panicked. The group turned in unison to see one of the younger boys, Tommy, standing at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and his finger pointing toward the trees. "There's something there," he shouted. The others squinted into the shadowy woods, their breaths puffing white in the freezing air. At first they saw nothing, just the dense underbrush and the skeletal branches swaying gently in the breeze. But then, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the group freeze in place. And then it stepped into view. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its hulking frame covered in thick, matted fur. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its massive arms swinging at its sides. But it was the eyes that held the kids in a trance. 2 glowing red orbs burned through the gloom, unblinking and intense. They locked onto the group, radiating an intelligence that was almost human, and a hunger that wasn't. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Danny shouted, "Run!" The group scattered, their screams echoing through the swamp as they fled. The ice cracked and splintered beneath their feet, sending shockwaves of fear through their already panicked minds. They slipped and stumbled, their boots sinking into the slushy ground as they clawed their way back toward the tree line. The creature didn't follow. It simply stood there at the edge of the clearing watching, its head tilted slightly, as if curious about their terror. But even as they reached the road, gasping for air and shaking from more than just the cold, they could feel its eyes on them. In the weeks that followed, the swamp took on a new, sinister presence in the minds of the children. They avoided it, but the memory of that day lingered like a shadow over their lives. Even years later, they would gather and recount the tale, their voices hushed and their eyes darting nervously toward the dark edge of the woods. The Hairy Man of Hockomock Swamp became a legend among them, a creature that was all too real. Story number 2. The Thunderbird of Bird Hill. It was a crisp autumn evening in 1971 when Sergeant Thomas Downey finished his shift and began the drive home along Winter Street. The road was desolate, bordered by dense woods that seemed to press in from either side. The only sound was the hum of his car's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Downey was used to these quiet drives. They gave him time to unwind, to let the stress of the day melt away. But that night, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, or the eerie stillness that hung in the air. Whatever it was, it set him on edge. As he approached Bird Hill, his headlights caught something on the road ahead. At first, he thought it was a deer, a common sight in the area. But as he got closer, he realized this was no deer. It was massive, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and an oddly hunched posture. Downey slowed the car, his breath hitching as the creature turned its head toward him. It was a bird. At least, it resembled one. Its body was covered in dark, glossy feathers that seemed to absorb the light, and its eyes glinted with an unsettling intelligence. But what struck Downey most was its wings. Even folded against its body, they seemed impossibly large, their tips brushing the ground like drapes. He stopped the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he and the creature simply stared at each other. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the bird spread its wings. They unfurled like a dark shroud, spanning the width of the road, and then some. The sheer size of them took Downey's breath away. They had to be at least 12 feet from tip to tip. The bird let out a low, guttural cry that resonated in Downey's chest. And then, with a single powerful motion, it lifted off the ground. Its ascent was unnervingly smooth, as if gravity had no hold on it. The sound of its wings cutting through the air was like distant thunder, a deep, rumbling whoosh that made the hairs on Downey's neck stand on end. He watched as it rose higher and higher, eventually disappearing into the inky blackness of the sky. For a long moment, Downey sat there, his heart pounding and his mind racing to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Was it some kind of prehistoric bird? An escaped zoo animal? Or something else entirely? When he finally made it home, he told no one. Who would believe him? A 12-foot bird on the outskirts of Bird Hill. It sounded like something out of a nightmare. But as the weeks went by, other sightings began to trickle in. Locals spoke of a thunderbird that haunted the skies, a creature as old as the land itself. Some claimed it was a harbinger of death, while others believed it was a protector of the swamp. Downey, however, kept his encounter to himself. He didn't want to feed the rumors or the fear that had taken root in his own heart. But every now and then, on quiet nights when the air was heavy and the shadows seemed too long, he would find himself looking toward the sky, half expecting to see those massive wings once more. Story number 3. The Luring Spirit of Raynham. William Russo had always been a creature of habit. Every night after his shift at the factory, he would take his dog, Samantha, for a walk. The Rottweiler Shepherd mix was his loyal companion, and their nightly strolls through the quiet streets of Raynham were a cherished ritual. But one night in 1990, something compelled Russo to change his route. Instead of heading toward the center of town, he decided to explore the trails behind his house. The area, known as the High Tees, was a stretch of land under high-tension power lines, overgrown with weeds and bordered by towering pines. By day, it was a shortcut for kids and hikers. By night, it was a place of shadows. The moon was bright that night, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. Russo walked slowly, letting Samantha lead the way. The dog seemed unusually alert, her ears perked and her head swiveling from side to side. Russo brushed it off as her reacting to the nocturnal wildlife. Raccoons, maybe, or a stray cat. They had been walking for about 15 minutes when they reached an old water wheel, a relic from the town's industrial past. A single streetlight stood nearby, its pale light pooling on the ground. As they approached, Samantha stopped abruptly. She began to growl, a low, rumbling sound that Russo had never heard before. "Easy, girl," he murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. But Samantha wasn't calming down. Her hackles were raised, and she was staring intently at something in the shadows. And then Russo heard it, a sound unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was a high-pitched wail, almost like a chant, echoing through the trees. "Iwan-chu!" it called. "Iwan-chu!" Russo froze, his heart pounding. The sound was coming closer, growing louder with each repetition. And then, out of the shadows, it appeared. The figure was small, barely 3 feet tall, and entirely covered in coarse, matted hair. It had a round, pot-bellied frame and disproportionately large eyes that glinted in the faint light. Its face was almost childlike, but there was something disturbingly ancient about it, like a relic from a time long forgotten. The creature stepped into the circle of light cast by the street lamp, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised one spindly arm and pointed at Russo, its chant growing louder and more insistent. "Iwan-chu! Kia! Kia!" Russo's legs felt rooted to the ground. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Samantha, however, was pulling at the leash with all her strength, barking furiously. The creature didn't move closer. It simply stood there, beckoning, as if daring Russo to step into the light. In a sudden burst of courage, or perhaps pure panic, Russo turned and fled, dragging Samantha behind him. The creature's chant followed him, echoing in his ears even as he reached the safety of his home. That night, Russo sat up for hours, replaying the encounter in his mind. What had it wanted? Why had it been calling to him? The questions haunted him, and they remain unanswered to this day. Like, subscribe, and click the notification bell for future videos. See you next time, and stay curious.